Okay, there are a couple things on rhetoric that I want to start off with to overview everything and to really help. If you've already gone through the Gorgias reading, then to help contextualize if you are going through the Gorgias reading alongside your notes, to help you contextualize as you read for the very first time. Either one, completely your choice. This video will work either way. So essentially we're in a time period, and I know this is so long ago, I mean thousands of years, right? But we're in a time period where for kind of the first time we're seeing people come together with the idea of we are going to self-govern, very broad category of enactions of democracy. And alongside that, or at the same time, or because the societal and cultural and just environmental constraints that lead to the ability to self-govern also lead to the ability to develop philosophy for the first time. We see a lot of connections and through democracy today, right? Between democracy, our understanding of government, our understanding of self and being, and we're going to see being not just in Gorgias and the Sophists, but we're also going to see it very heavily with Plato, because Plato is kind of the first philosopher to an extent. And then connected to all of that, we have a lot of questions about education. Not just what is education, what is the purpose of education, who needs to be educated if we're heading towards this idea of self-governance, who can be in charge of self-governance. All of these ideas are very intertwined and they're very difficult to pull apart, and that's where a lot of these theories are coming from, or the difficulty in pulling them apart, including, this is the really important part, including the inability to really tease apart, because it's the first time that humans have done this. Who are we as beings navigating this cultural, honestly, just cultural world? The idea of being, we've got about 1,000 years until Descartes says, I know, therefore I think, therefore I am. But we're seeing the beginnings of that idea. We're seeing people with time and the resources to sit down and think, to spend their time thinking instead of hunting and gathering or farming or just the general nature of life. Obviously, yes, there are still wars that are happening here, and so there are still the realities of how do we keep large numbers of people alive, to keep the, in Greek times, the polis alive and functioning and operating. That is still a concern. But alongside that concern, we have a group of people with, honestly, time to burn. And with that time to burn, they start philosophizing. Who am I? Why am I? Who am I in relation to all of these other things? And then once we start doing that, we start to persuade other people, I am this, or I believe this, and I want you to believe the same thing. And so that's where we get this really strong connection, okay? So throughout all of the Greek rhetoric, we have kind of underlying it all. We have the first time in recorded human history. This has happened before, but we have developed a way to record with writing, even though the predominant method, especially with Plato, hated the pencil. This is a whole different video, but Plato, the pencil ruined all thinking and all humanity. The way that, in today's time, we're AI is ruining everything. Plato said the pencil is ruining everything. It's amazing. It's amazing how these arguments come back. Yeah, it's a whole different set of problems too. That's, soapbox during office hours, not during these videos. So what we're seeing is large groups of people who have time, and so they want to self-govern, and they're building this idea of democracy, and they're starting to realize really quickly that democracy requires an educated group of people to make decisions. And so they're starting to really think, okay, what does it mean to be an educated group of people? And that's where rhetoric and these ideas, these philosophies of rhetoric, what we're calling rhetorical theory, start to become developed. And what we will see is that for the most part, the rhetorical theory audience or group was fairly monotonous or monotone. It was the rich, white, for the time, men who owned land, who then contributed to the belief system. And then they started defining citizenship, and then they started looking at, okay, so what parts of this, how is citizenship granted in our democracy, and then where does education align with that? And once we've decided that, and Greeks were obviously conquering a lot of other nations in the whole region, what do we do with these non-citizens? Where does education align with them? And we see this question come up over and over and over. So we see it with the sophists, who should be educated and who shouldn't. We see it with Plato, completely different answers. So the sophists are educating as many people as they can on the street corners. So when you get hooded at a ceremony, you know, the hood goes and then it goes around your neck here and then it hangs in the back and there's an actual hood or like a pouch at the bottom of the hood. And what the sophists did is they would talk about persuasive theories, like educate other people on how to develop, you know, a 5-paragraph essay. If you start to read through the sophists, you'll see 5-paragraph essay. It started with the sophists. Good job, guys. We're still doing that. So how to develop an intro, how to develop points, how to support those particular points, what types of supports were really helpful, how to develop a conclusion. So they're talking about the theory of developing or framing a persuasive argument. And then the people who were hearing that, which for the sophists was everybody, then the people would give money by putting it in the pouch, in the hood. And we still wear that as a part of our regalia today, and that is kind of the function of it. So the goal of this video, that's getting a little lengthy, so sorry, I go on tangents. Citizenship is a part of the underlying question, although it's not directly dealt with. Rhetorical theory develops as a result of questions of citizenship. Rhetorical theory develops as a result of free time. Rhetorical theory develops as a result of questions about democracy and what democracy should look like and how they want to theorize that. And what we'll see moving forward through time periods, so we're going to focus very heavily on the Greeks, and then we have the Middle Ages, and then we have the Enlightenment, and with the Enlightenment comes science and a real heavy focus on rhetoric as only style. And we'll talk about that briefly because we're not going to spend a ton of time there. And then we start to get to contemporary understandings where rhetoric is a whole bunch of different things. And so we'll talk about that later. But in this time period and moving forward and then moving into the, you know, just following the timeline of human development, rhetorical theory is very heavily discussed and theorized for a very long time when humans are trying to figure out democracy and self-governance and the connection between education, persuasion, arguments, style, all wrapped up in how do we talk about citizenship, how do we control citizenry, how do we control police or cities, not police, but the P-O-L-I-S, the polis, the city-state. How do we develop laws? How do we enact them? How do we enforce them? How do we use a combination of enforcement and like accessible language so that those two go in hand and people have a really clear understanding of what's going on? How do we communicate this to people? What are the different groups? And they start even early talking about what are the places. And so it's one of my questions with Plato. What are the places of rhetoric, the spaces? Where is rhetoric used? The big thing to remember here is rhetorical theory is developed as an invention technique. How do I put together arguments? Where do I determine what the best decisions in developing an argument are? They are not designed for, at all, use in critiquing others. We will look at, and all of the theorists of the time period provide sample arguments as a way to instruct on. And so we have, you know, we're going to talk about this more when we get to the Plato reading. We have this really difficult way of like teasing apart the way that we use an example today to critique and to talk about what are the norms and what are the cultural things going on here and what are we supposed to take away, when at the time period what we can piece together based on the few texts, because remember the Library at Alexandria burned, so we have very few texts that have survived, although we do have texts that survived, which is amazing in itself. Of the texts that survived, what we can tell is that the examples that were used were not for critique. The terminology that is developed surrounding rhetorical theory, so dialectic, ethos, pathos, logos, kairos, none of those are developed as a mode of critiquing a text. The text and the examples are used to be instructive. They are literally pedagogy in action. You're watching this video and I'm using very specific pedagogical approaches to supplement the notes that you are going to take. This is a pedagogical strategy. The use of, you know, so the Plato's dialogues are the most famous from the Greek text. Plato's dialogues were not a critique on, yes, they're talking through definitions of rhetorical theory through example, but they're not a critique on the way that we look at a critique, like literary analysis. They are not a rhetorical analysis. They are a mode of instructing on the right and wrong ways that rhetorical theory should be understood. So there's a huge difference there. Ethos, pathos, and logos are often used as critique, and they really fall short because that's not what they're designed to do. Okay, so the big takeaway is you start everything really is that rhetorical theory developed because of a need to understand democracy and self-governing, and it develops alongside that. When democracy, self-governing, citizenship, and citizen input are the basis of a society, we see rhetorical theory flourish, the developing of rhetorical theory. When those are not, so the Middle Ages specifically, we don't see rhetorical theory discussed, we do not see it flourished, we see it very heavily defined as just one thing, one approach, and in service to just one little minor piece. But then when we head into the Enlightenment and we see, you know, a return towards democracy, and then eventually we see it with America specifically, we see rhetorical theory again, like the development of rhetorical theory flourish again because it serves that really bizarre mix of what is the purpose of education, what is the purpose of citizenship, what does citizenry look like, and how does that operate to keep democracy alive. And then in all of that, persuasion has to happen in a whole variety of different ways for a whole variety of different purposes. And so rhetorical theory as a way of understanding how to develop persuasion develops in that melting pot. Okay, it's a big overview of rhetorical theory. If you have questions, let me know, but that's to help you just get started, because the first like page and a quarter of the Sophist kind of assumes that you understand that. So hopefully that helps you a little bit with, here are the underlying assumptions of what's going on at the time, and this is where the Sophists started. Let me know if you have any questions.